Is storytelling the secret for giving better speeches and making stronger presentations? We'll talk about that in a moment.
Welcome to the Brand Telling Podcast, where we share secrets, systems, and strategies you can use to unleash the power of story to build and grow your brand. The Brand Telling Podcast is brought to you by the award-winning team at Communication Strategy Group, bringing a combined 50-plus years of publishing, agency, and client strategy, creative, and tactical marketing experience. Please welcome your hosts, Principal and Chief Brand Teller Arthur Germain and Creative Director Michael Simbram.
My guest today on the podcast is JT Compeau. JT is the founder of the Content Interpreter, for which he serves as a speechwriter and thought leadership and public speaking consultant. He has developed captivating speeches, brand narratives, and thought leadership pieces for entrepreneurs and professionals across a variety of industries, including advertising, architecture, business coaching, Wall Street, and journalism. I'd like you to welcome to the podcast, JT Compeau. JT, welcome to the podcast.
Arthur, thank you so much for having me.
So, JT, in our little pre-conversation to the podcast, we were talking about how we seem to be, pretty well aligned and have some similar backgrounds. Maybe you could start telling the audience a little bit about your background and how you got into doing the work you do, and then maybe we'll move into talking a little bit about the work.
Well, absolutely. And I appreciate that question because I think that origin stories are really important. That's a lot of what I like to infuse into my work with clients. So I went to Syracuse University, Newhouse School, and I graduated with a television, radio, and film degree, did some radio while I was there, came out of school, started working at media agencies, a couple of the big four conglomerates there in consumer insights, media research, market research, that sort of thing. My career evolved to where I was working in more of client services, and the company that I was working for at the time paired me with a PR consultant, and we started to pitch the trade press, the ad weeks and the Martech advisors of the world, those kinds of publications. And it turns out that I had a real love of telling the story of this company that I was working for. And so when I departed that company at the end of 2017, I said, I would love to keep doing this across industries. I'd always been a member of Toastmasters. And so what I'm doing now, founding the Content Interpreter, was really just this convergence of all of those different experiences that I'd had over a decade and a half or so.
Well, that's great. What I like in your origin story is really, well, first off, the way you tell it is terrific, but you hit on a lot of topics and trends that I think are really important to Marcom communicators today. You talked a little bit about data stories, in your work working in research, and then in PR, in trade and MarTech, and we know there's been such shifts in the PR landscape. And the idea of your love of story and even your background in Toastmasters, all leading and building to this idea so that the Content Interpreter is now a consultancy for really working to help founders, to help entrepreneurs, and to help businesses better tell their story, which is where I think, we're really very well aligned. What we've looked at is this idea of brand storytelling, or what we call brand telling, to really get at the heart of who a company is, who an individual is, and to share what we call their story leadership, what people often call their thought leadership. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how you work, your process for helping a client to uncover their story. And then a small challenge: why do you think it is that so many founders have that challenge in telling the story about themselves?
That's an interesting question. And I'll actually answer that last one first because I think it's so important and I appreciate the question. I think it's difficult, and I can speak to this now that I have been in the founder's seat, is that it's very difficult to talk about oneself. I think that there's always kind of this monitor on yourself. You don't want to appear as if you're puffing yourself up, beyond your own abilities. And I think it's hard to simply just see objectively the value that you bring sometime. I think everybody has a script, a story of like, well, I do this, I do this, I do this. But there are so many things in our experience, both professionally and personally, that we can bring to the table. And so that was really the heart of the concept that I wanted to bring to my clients when I'm helping them write their speeches and their talks and presentations, is that it's all relevant. And even if we're not using a specific aspect of your professional experience in the speech itself, it's subtext. It can help inform how we're going to organize or how we're going to write that particular speech or talk or presentation. So I think it's really valuable. And I appreciate you recognizing that in my own origin story too, because I'm a big believer in that. So everything that I'm doing today, I'm using a tool in the toolbox that I may have acquired last year or when I first started my professional life.
I like that you talk about relevancy. It's often what we see missing, and I think especially, unfortunately, we see it a lot in our work with B2B audiences and B2B teams, is that they will talk about maybe a product, a service, the brand, without really, drawing that deep connection to what the value the brand brings to that customer. So talking about themselves, maybe not bragging, but even talking about themselves without making the clear connection, whether it's a technology or a service or something. Maybe you can talk a little bit about how to find that value or how to find that relevant note that really is going to resonate with an audience.
Yeah, absolutely. It's challenging. I wouldn't lie to your audience or to any prospective client of mine. It requires, I think, a lot of reflection. And I think the value add that I bring to my clients is that I'm that collaborator in their corner that can help you sort through it all. I worked with a journalist last year during commencement season. And as you could probably imagine, she has a plethora of stories. She's been all over the world. She's covered our political system. She's covered political events in every corner of the world, or so it seemed. And it was more with her. It was more of a question of, well, how do we sort through this? How do we find the thread that goes through each one of these so that we can tie it together into a cohesive story? So the part that I bring, the value that I bring to my clients is just sitting down and saying, okay, tell me about your career. I'll have done a lot of research on you. I've watched your videos. In one case, I had to read parts of my client's book because she was the noted expert in her particular area of research. And so I come to it with an advanced knowledge, and I don't really have any set agenda. I like to think of them as conversations rather than interviews. And I'm really just listening for the things that pop out and interest me. Not to be self-serving or to make it about myself, but I think that as a layperson, to pretty much every client that I've ever worked with, I've been the layperson to their industry. I'm listening for the things that will make their story more accessible to an audience. So, for example, with this journalist that I've been talking about, who had such an impressive career, we were trying to get to, well, what is the singular theme? And she kept going back to this idea of paying her dues. And over the years, she had had her brushes with famous journalists that whose names we would all know. And she felt like each brush with these famous people, these household names, was bringing her one step closer to where she needed to be. And so we threaded that needle, so to speak, to say, okay, well, each story that you're going to tell is going to be great advice to these students that are coming into the field that you came into once upon a time. And wouldn't it be great if that was what we communicated to them, but we did it through the stories that you were telling, so that they understood that what I'm doing right now, I'm sitting and listening to this accomplished journalist and news anchor. She sat where I sat, and we all have to start somewhere. And she was where I was, and look at this. And she has a great career, and she kept learning through each of the stories that she was assigned to cover, or the stories that she herself uncovered. So that is really, I think, something very powerful. And no two clients are the same. Obviously, everyone has a different story. Everyone has a different perception. They relate to things differently. But that is more or less how the process shapes up with each and every client, and we sculpt it.
I like that example because I think that phrase is a phrase we've all heard. You need to pay your dues, or everybody has to start somewhere. And as a phrase, it's fine, but trying to talk to your audience and explain, well, what do you mean by pay your dues? The best way, and it sounds like you found it as well, the best way that we found is, well, tell a story. I often tell a story about myself when I was in print production, that it was just on the onset of desktop publishing, and I wanted to learn how to move my publication over to what was kind of a WYSIWYG format. And I noticed that one of the other publications in our publishing house was already doing that. So I asked the woman there if she could help me move my publication there. And the production editor said, well, I'll tell you what, we're putting out the largest issue of our year. And if you'll come over here when you're done working over there and help me put out pages, I'll then show you how to do it. So my movement, my paying my dues was I had to work after work for this woman to help her put together pages. And in doing so, she showed me and shared with me what I needed to do for my own publication. And that helped me in my career. It helped me to receive a promotion and to do some work there. But it's often lost on people if you just say, well, I paid my dues. There's no story at that point.
Right. And your story is fantastic, because I think we've all been in a situation like that, especially when we're first starting out, where we have to take a step back. We may emerge having great credentials, right, and a great education, and you're ready to take on the world. And then you realize, like, wow, there's so much I don't know. Let me take a step back so that I can later take a step forward. So yeah, I really appreciate that aspect of it. And she was dedicated to that concept too, and still is, obviously, as she continues on in her career. But it was really fascinating to sit with this woman virtually, of course, and listen to her stories and see how she still had that hunger after a couple of decades.
So maybe you can talk to me, because what I'm hearing is this idea, this strength or this power in authentic storytelling. Maybe you can talk for a little bit about, what is it that, makes that compelling story in your mind?
I think it is, well, from my perspective, where I'm helping them write these speeches, talks, and presentations, my commitment to them from the beginning is that I'm not going to make you sound like me. I'm not going to make you sound like any other speaker, although it's okay to have your role models and your idols, of course. I really want to plug in to you. So I work as hard as I can to find their voice. So that's the biggest piece of it, I think. The other part of it that comes into my head as you were asking the question is finding ways to, even if it's a very professional affair, finding ways to let humor come in if it's appropriate. I worked with a professor once who was giving a speech in front of 100+ ER physicians and staff. And we found ways in that very serious topic, in a very serious forum, to let some humor come in. And I think she said, "Oh, Grey's Anatomy is one of my favorite shows." And, I don't know. I'm not a doctor, so I can't speak to how accurate Grey's Anatomy depicts the medical field and what actually happens in a hospital. But it was really interesting. And we followed that a little bit. And again, we used that little piece of humor, that little window into her interests beyond what she was speaking into, to guide some of the other pieces of content that we were adapting from her book. So it was really interesting. So I think it's finding the voice is the biggest part of it, but then also just finding little ways to connect with the audience that maybe you didn't think were accessible to you, or didn't seem like now is the time, or didn't seem that it was entirely appropriate. Audiences, I think, want to have that little bit of permission from time to time to say, like, "Oh, okay, well, we can laugh a little bit," especially in something that can be serious and maybe throughout the presentation. And this isn't to say anything of the content of anyone's work, but I think that's the reason why we have storytelling, is so that people can be taken on a journey rather than just presented with a bunch of material that then they have to make sense of.
I think that makes a lot of sense. The idea of a journey. We often talk, when we build B2B content, we talk about the buyer's journey, and it's kind of a nurturing journey. But even within the confines of a single speech presentation, you are telling a journey, and you're taking somebody along with you, at least if you're doing it the right way. I have a question. When you think about what's going on today, and I hate the term virtual, because you really are in front of somebody, but you're just not physically in front of them. Do you think that there are changes that need to happen in the way that you tell a story when you can't physically be in front of either your small or your large audience? And for example, when I have presented in front of a medium-sized audience, perhaps, I might ask a question and look for a show of hands. I look for people to nod. I look to see if I'm still capturing the attention, because I notice if everybody looks down at their mobile, maybe I've lost them. I'm no longer relevant for them. Do you have any recommendations there, as we look at today's, Zoom presentation world?
That's a great question. And I think it's something that we are all struggling with, myself included. And I think that I did a blog post about this, actually, right when the pandemic, well, not when it began, but when it was clear to all of us that this is a real serious thing. So circa mid-March. And I think it starts with all of us just doing what we do best. I was noticing, like, on late night television, for example, like, all the hosts were going remote and doing their shows from home. And I think that the ones that survived this studio to home transition were the ones that just did what they do best. They didn't try to alter their message dramatically to meet the moment. And you have to acknowledge it, obviously, but you can't, I don't think, get so distracted by it that it eats away at the core of what it is that you do. So that was my first thought on it. And then from purely a presentation standpoint, like you were referring to, when you're on stage and you gesture and you can use the stage and make very deliberate movements. I think that it's just a lot more pressure on you to be able to sell your presentation through your eyes and your facial expression, and to have that powerful voice, not the voice in a speech, but literally your speaking voice, to be able to sell that through. I think that those are important skills on which we can all work. And I'm including myself when I say this. I produced, before the pandemic, I produced a bunch of videos for a speech writing video guide that that folks can take a look at on my various platforms. And I myself hired a wonderful public speaking coach who had a background in theater production and in television to help with the lighting and also how I was projecting and everything. So it is a skill set that is becoming more and more relevant as we go on, because from my understanding of what's happening in the speaking industry and from hearing heads of speaking bureaus talk is that there's still demand for content. There's still demand for great speakers. It's just how we're delivering it is
Sure.
what's different.
Sure. We find the same. We run the Long Island Speakers Bureau, and we still had people coming to us and asking for those speakers because it's not, can you have a speaker come to a single location where we're going to have a bunch of people at a single location, but it is, can your speaker in one location talk to our audience in many locations and still fulfill that need? I think just as a people, we still have that need to hear from people, to have that conversation, and to be part of that audience. So, I think you're absolutely correct. It's just, how can we modify slightly what we do to use the medium that's right now available to us?
Yes, and if you don't mind, I'd actually like to ask you a question about that. How has your reach changed? Has it improved dramatically now that these events are virtual and in theory everyone around the world could join? Has that given you an edge, do you think, as a head of a speaking bureau?
I'm not sure. We've been a local bureau really to help local business people have their own ability to share the kind of content that they have and really share their story leadership with others. So that reach has usually been local. I'd say, though, that while we did see demand fall off a cliff for a little while there, we have recently seen things come back and people looking for more speakers again and coming to the bureau. So the bureau is really just a local spot to look for speakers. So I'll have to see if we see the demand, the geography widen, because that should be next, right? That would be something we'll see. And I did want to say one thing I thought about as you were speaking about the late night hosts. I think that you really hit on something about doing what they do best. And I have to say, I've been disappointed in one of the late night hosts who was always a favorite of mine prior to the pandemic, was Stephen Colbert. And I've been disappointed in the way that his show has fallen, not because he has, the writing has fallen or anything, but because I think Stephen really feeds off an audience. And I've often thought that they ought to just, let him have a Zoom audience of 100 each evening who just show up on a big 60-inch monitor that he sees that feeds into a headset for him, just to hear people laugh, clap, and shout out to him, because I think he needs that to boost him up. And I think that might be something that we all need to consider sometimes when we're doing these non-physical groups, is to, we mute our audience, but sometimes maybe we need to unmute the audience a little bit just to hear the feedback.
There's a great idea. It reminds me of when I was in radio as a student, and it was a student-run station, but we would compete with the commercial stations in the market. And I used to do a morning show with a good friend of mine. We're still good friends to this day. And we would do little bits of comedy because it was a morning show. And when you are by yourself in a room that is covered in those foam eggshells, you have no idea if something is actually funny or not. And so it was always a really big test. So I imagine that going from a theater, especially one as majestic as the Ed Sullivan Theater, and it's absolutely beautiful, I've been in it quite a few times, to doing it from your home, just that dynamic alone is going to be really challenging. So that I like your idea. That's a great idea.
Well, I appreciate that. And I appreciate you joining us today for the podcast. Maybe you can tell our audience a little bit about how to connect with you if they are looking for assistance in developing their voice, developing a speech, working on a presentation. What's the best way to get hold of you, JT?
Oh, absolutely. And thank you for the opportunity. So my website is contentinterpreter.com. And so there you'll find links to chat with me, schedule some time on my calendar. And you'll also find there, if you go to contentinterpreter.com/free-guide, you will find a place where you can put your email, and I will send you videos, short 2 to 3 minute videos on how you can get started with your talk or your speech. And some of it touches on what we've discussed today, but it goes a little bit deeper, and it gives a window and an insight into how we might work together if that's the route that you choose.
That's great. Thank you again, my guest, JT Compeau, the founder of Content Interpreter, and look at JT's website. And if you need someone to help you with that presentation, to help you sharpen up the way that you are presenting yourself, especially if you're a founder kind of struggling to get that message, contact JT there. Thank you again for joining us on the Brand Telling Podcast.
Thank you so much.
Build a better brand story for your business. Schedule a complimentary consultation with the brand tellers at Communication Strategy Group. Send a note to contact-us at gocsg.com or visit us at communicationstrategygroup.com/contact.